To be a Psyker is not to be gifted. It is to be afflicted. It is to be born with a soul that is a festering wound in the fabric of reality, a crack in the dam that holds back an ocean of insanity. In the grand, brutal calculus of the Imperium of man, you are not a person. You are a weapon, a tool, a resource, and most terrifyingly of all, a time bomb in human form, ticking down to a cataclysm of unimaginable proportions. You are the key to the Imperium's survival, the very thing that allows its fleets to navigate the stars and its edicts, to cross the void. Yet you are also its most hated, its most feared, its most persecuted creation. This is the fundamental damning paradox of your existence. You are necessary, and you are abhorred. To understand this curse, one must first attempt to comprehend the Imperium, the realm that is the source of your power. Do not think of it as some ethereal plane of magic, a reservoir of arcane energy to be tapped and shaped by a clever will. That is a child's fantasy, a fatal lie. The warp is a living, breathing, screaming ocean of raw, untamed emotion. It is the collected psychic effluence of every thinking, feeling creature in the galaxy since the dawn of time. Every surge of rage, every pang of despair, every shriek of agony, every twisted lust and bitter hatred, it all bleeds into this psychic sewer, coalescing, stirring, and achieving a horrifying consciousness of its own. It is a dimension of pure chaos, unbound by the logic of time and space, and it is populated. Oh, it is populated. Its depths swarm with predators carved from pure malevolence, entities whose very existence is anathema to life and reason, demons whose hunger for mortal souls is as infinite as the void itself. And your soul, the soul of a Psyker, is a lighthouse in the heart of this storm. While a normal human soul is but a dim, guttering candle in the darkness, barely perceptible, yours is a blazing, screaming bonfire. It is a beacon of warmth, life, and energy in an infinite frozen void, and it draws the sharks from the depths. They see your light. They feel your warmth. They hear your thoughts as a siren's call across the ether. They circle, they whisper, they promise, and they wait for a moment of weakness, a crack in your resolve, a lapse in your control. They wait for the moment they can sink their teeth into your soul and use your body as a gateway, a door through which they can spill into the material world and feast upon the souls of all you have ever known. The Imperium of man, in its 10,000 years of brutal, desperate wisdom, understands this better than anyone. It has seen worlds die. It has seen entire star systems snuffed out like candles, their populations turned into screaming, fleshy monuments to a single Psyker's moment of weakness. It has witnessed reality itself, unmade, twisted into a playground for the laughing gods of chaos. This is why they fear you. This is why they hate you. To the ecclesiarchy, you are a blasphemy in flesh, a soul pre-damned. To the common citizen, you are the witch, the heretic, the monster from their darkest stories made real. To the Astra Militarum, you are a living artillery piece that could misfire at any moment, vaporizing your own allies. An unsanctioned Psyker is not a threat. It is an extinction-level event waiting to happen. It is not a possibility of damnation. It is a mathematical certainty. The only questions are when and how many billions of souls will be dragged screaming into hell along with you. The vast, grinding machinery of the Imperium is therefore dedicated to one singular purpose regarding your kind control. Absolute, unrelenting, and merciless control. It is a mission of containment, a galactic-scale quarantine of the soul. From the moment your curse manifests, you are no longer your own. You become the property of the Adeptus Terra, a resource to be harvested, processed, and expended in the Emperor's name. So what of the soul trapped within this catastrophic vessel? What is the true lived experience of the man, woman, or child cursed with such a gift? Before the brutal sanctioning, before the agonizing training, before the endless servitude, what is the dawning horror of a mind that can hear the whispers in the dark? What is the life of a soul damned not by choice, but by the very nature of its birth? It does not begin with a flash of light or a surge of glorious power. It begins with a dream. For the boy named Kalen, living in the smog-choked, overcrowded underhive of Scintilla, it began with a dream of falling. He was falling through a rust-red sky, the air thick with the screams of things that were not quite birds. Below him, the spires of his hive city were not made of steel and rockcrete, but of weeping, twisted flesh and bone. He saw faces in the clouds, faces that contorted with a malevolence so pure it felt like ice in his veins. They didn't speak in words. They spoke in feelings. They whispered of fear and loneliness, and the sweet, terrible freedom that came with letting go of all that bound him to the world. He would wake up screaming, his thin mattress soaked in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of their voices still echoing in the hollows of his skull. His mother would rush in her face, etched with the perpetual worry of a hive dweller, and hold him, telling him it was just the recycled air, the poor Nutri-slurry they'd had for their meal. But Kalen knew it was more. The dreams were just the beginning. Soon, the whispers followed him into the waking world. He started seeing them at the edges of his vision in the deepest shadows of the hab block corridors. He called them the Shadow Men. They were tall and thin, distorted figures that seemed to ripple and warp the air around them. When he tried to look at them directly, they would vanish, but he could feel their presence, a cold spot in the ever-present cloying heat of the underhive. He tried to tell his friends, the other children who spent their days picking through refuse piles for salvageable tech scraps. They laughed at first, then they grew wary. Kalen was strange. The world itself began to warp around his burgeoning, untamed emotions. One day, a rival scavenger, a bigger, crueler boy named Grohl, cornered him and stole a valuable power coil Kalen had found. A surge of pure, childish rage, hot and white, coursed through him. Kalen didn't scream or fight back. He just stared. And across the narrow alley, a heavy rusted light fixture groaned, tore free from its mounting, and crashed down, missing Grohl by inches. The older boy scrambled away, his face pale with a terror that had nothing to do with a near-death experience. It was a primal fear of the unnatural, the impossible. Another time, his mother was weeping over their meager rations. A wave of sorrow and empathy washed over Kalen, so powerful it felt like drowning. In the corner of their small hab, a single withered nutrient fungus clinging to life in a cracked pot suddenly bloomed, its pale flesh vibrant and full. These were not moments of joy or discovery. They were moments of profound horror. He was not in control. He was a passenger in his own body, a vessel for a power that responded to his deepest, most volatile feelings. He felt a gnawing fear of himself, a terrifying alienation from the very hands he used to eat, and the mind that dreamed. His family, once a source of comfort, now became a source of anxiety. He could see the fear in his father's eyes when a drinking glass would rattle on the table as he grew agitated. He could feel his mother's unspoken prayers to the God Emperor, prayers for protection from her own son. The other children stopped speaking to him altogether. They would make the sign of the Aquila when he passed, warding off evil. He was no longer just Kalen. He was a bad omen. The whispers in his head grew louder, clearer. They weren't just feelings anymore. They were words, promises. They told him he was special, powerful. They told him his family was weak, that they feared what they could not understand. They urged him to embrace the power to show them all what he could do. The rumors spread through the hab block like a contagion. Cursed, witchkin, warp-touched. The local priest of the Imperial Creed, a gaunt, fanatical man with burning eyes, began delivering sermons from his makeshift pulpit, his voice echoing through the grimy plazas, speaking of the insidious threat of the mutant, the heretic, and the unsanctioned Psyker. He spoke of the purity of the human form, the sanctity of the soul, and the cleansing fire that was the Emperor's only mercy for such abominations. Every word felt like a nail being driven into Kalen's coffin. He was no longer just an outcast. He was the monster in the sermon. He was the prey. The betrayal came not from a neighbor nor from the fanatical priest, but from within the four walls of his own hab unit. It was his father. Kalen saw him one evening, slipping out into the smog-lit gloom of the corridor, his face a mask of grim determination and utter despair. He was heading towards the local enforcer precinct, the Adeptus Arbites garrison that kept the hive's brutal order. Later, Kalen would understand. It was not an act of malice, but an act of terrified faith. The priest had preached that to harbor a witch was to condemn one's own soul to the pyre. To surrender the afflicted was a painful but necessary act of piety. In his father's mind, twisted by fear and dogma, he was not condemning his son. He was attempting to save his own soul, and that of his wife, from the damnation his child represented. He was trading his son's life for a chance at the Emperor's forgiveness. The enforcers did not come with subtlety. They came with the thunder of armored boots on grimy steel walkways. It was a suppression squad clad in the black carapace armor of the Adeptus Arbites, their faces hidden behind impassive, scowling visors. With them were men from the ecclesiarchy, robed zealots holding flamers and chanting litanies of purification. They were not there to investigate, to question, or to understand. They were there to purge. The squad kicked in the flimsy door to their hab unit, splintering it from its frame. The lead arbitrator pointed a shotgun at Kalen, the weapon's barrel looking like a gaping maw. By the authority of the Lex Imperialis, you are charged with unsanctioned psychana. The sentence is death. The hab block erupted into a war zone. His mother screamed a raw animal sound of pure anguish, trying to shield him with her own body. A zealot shoved her aside with the butt of his flamer. Kalen's father stood frozen in the doorway, his face a canvas of horror, perhaps only now realizing the brutal finality of his actions. The neighbors, once a community, now peered from behind barricaded doors, or joined the zealots in their chorus of condemnation. Cleanse the witch, they screamed. Burn the mutant. The enforcers advanced, their weapons raised. The air crackled with a palpable hatred, a righteous terror that filled the cramped space and choked the very air from Kalen's lungs. He was cornered, a terrified animal trapped with no way out. The whispers in his mind, once seductive, now shrieked with a desperate primal urgency. They will kill you. They will burn you. Let us in. We can save you. Show them true power. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands clamped over his ears as if he could physically block out the encroaching madness from within and the brutal reality from without. The lead arbitrator took another step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. The pressure inside Kalen's head became unbearable, a star of pure agony threatening to go supernova behind his eyes. And then it broke. It was not a wave of energy he could control. It was a dam bursting. A raw, untamed torrent of pure warp energy erupted from his small body, an incoherent scream of pure terror, given physical form. The world went white. The air temperature in the corridor instantly flash-boiled, peeling paint from the walls. The arbitrator closest to him simply ceased to exist. His armor and flesh turned to incandescent vapor. The others in the squad staggered back, clutching their heads as their minds were shredded by the psychic onslaught. The zealot who had shoved his mother collapsed, his body convulsing as his brain boiled within his skull. Inside the hab, the glass of a small pict frame containing an image of their family shattered. The cheap metal furniture buckled and twisted as if gripped by an unseen hand. His mother was thrown back against a wall, slumping to the ground, unconscious. His father, standing in the doorway, simply stared, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with a catatonic understanding of the hell he had unleashed. The innocence that remained in Kalen, the small, frightened child, was scoured away in that single terrible moment. He had not just confirmed their fears, he had become them. He was the monster, and he had just shown them his teeth. The aftermath of the psychic detonation was not chaos, but a profound and unnerving silence. The psychic scream had echoed through the Imperium, and in the cold void high above the planet, something had heard it. Something had been waiting. The first sign was not a sight or a sound, but a feeling. A deep, unsettling nullity washed over the hive city, a psychic void that smothered the background chatter of a billion minds. It was a profound emptiness, a chilling absence of soul that felt more terrifying than any presence. For Kalen, whose mind was a raw, open wound to the warp, it was like being plunged into a sensory deprivation tank filled with ice. The whispers in his head did not fade. They were violently torn away, leaving behind a sterile, horrifying quiet. Then the sky darkened. It was not the passing of a cloud in Scintilla's perpetually gray atmosphere. A new, absolute darkness blotted out the hive's artificial lights. A monolithic vessel so vast it defied comprehension had taken up position in low orbit. It was a void ship of archaic design, its hull a featureless, non-reflective black that seemed to drink the light around it. It bore no sigils of the Imperial Navy, no honorifics of a rogue trader dynasty. It was silent, ominous, and utterly implacable. The common citizens of the hive did not know its name, but the powerful and the informed trembled. It was a vessel of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, a black ship. The tithe had come. Down in the scarred and bloodied corridor, new figures emerged from the gloom. They were not the brutal enforcers or the rabid zealots. These were professionals. At the fore were tall, imposing women clad in Baroque golden armor, their faces obscured by ornate helmets. They carried massive bolters with an ease that belied their weight. But their most terrifying quality was the psychic void that emanated from them, the source of the silence that now blanketed the district. They were the Silent Sisterhood, the anathema Psycana psychic blanks, to whom the warp was a closed book, and whose very presence was a torment to any Psyker. Kalen felt a new kind of pain as they approached, a soul-deep nausea, as if his very essence was being unwoven. With them were the agents of the League of Black Ships, robed investigators and hulking servitor guards. Their movements were cold, efficient, and devoid of any emotion. They stepped over the corpses of the Arbites and the Zealots with dispassionate disregard. One of them held a complex Auspex device that whirred and clicked as it pointed directly at Kalen. Subject confirmed, the agent stated, his voice a monotone. Potency rating Gamma+, unstable, secure for transit. There was no negotiation, no condemnation, no prayer. It was the detached language of a harvest. The guards moved in. Kalen, drained and terrified, had no fight left in him. They did not treat him like a child. They treated him like a volatile piece of ordnance. One guard clamped a heavy metallic collar around his neck, which hissed with arcane energies, making his thoughts feel sluggish and thick. Another shackled his hands and feet with cuffs that seemed to hum with a low, oppressive frequency, cutting him off even further from the warp. They didn't speak to him. They didn't even look him in the eye. They simply hoisted him up by his arms and began to drag him away, his feet scraping against the grimy floor. He saw his father still frozen in the doorway, his face a hollow mask of grief. Their eyes met for a single, fleeting second. There was no hatred in Kalen's gaze, only a vast, empty despair. He was no longer his father's son. He was a tithe, a thing to be collected. He was marched through the silent, terrified crowds and loaded onto a transport shuttle that was as stark and functional as a coffin. The final ascent to the black ship was a silent journey into the dark. The ship's interior was a vision of dread. The corridors were vast and cold, forged from the same light-devouring metal as the hull. The air was sterile and smelled of ozone and recycled fear. He was thrown, not led, into a cavernous cargo bay, a veritable human warehouse of misery. Thousands of others were there, Psykers gathered from a dozen worlds across the sector. They were of all ages and species, from whimpering children younger than himself to ancient wizened abhumans. Some rattled their chains and screamed, their minds broken. Others sat in catatonic silence, their eyes vacant and staring. A few whispered and plotted in the corners, deluding themselves with hopes of escape. The air was thick with the psychic stench of terror, hopelessness, and a collective silent scream of souls trapped in a cage. This was not a rescue from the witch hunt. This was merely a more organized, more efficient form of the same damnation. The journey to Holy Terra had begun, and for the countless souls crammed into this floating hell, it was the first leg of a journey to the center of the Imperium's soul-grinding machine. The journey in the black ship was a timeless agony, a blur of darkness, hunger, and the suffocating despair of 10,000 captive minds. When the great vessel finally docked within the orbital plates of Terra Kalan, and the other survivors were herded out like cattle into the blinding ancient light of the throne world. They were marched under the gaze of colossal statues of primarchs and saints through canyons of adamantium and marble. Their procession, a miserable, shuffling footnote in the glorious history of the Imperium. Their destination was not a palace, but a prison. A fortress monastery of grim, imposing design, burrowed deep into the rock of the Himalaysian mountain range, the Scholastia Psychana. This was to be their school, but its purpose was not to educate, but to break. It was not a place of enlightenment, but an anvil upon which their souls would be hammered into submission. The first lesson began the moment they were stripped, scrubbed raw, and thrown into the sterile gray uniforms of a neophyte. An instructor, a man whose face was a web of scars and whose eyes held no pity, addressed the terrified new arrivals. "You are not gifted," he boomed, his voice augmented and harsh. "You are flawed. You are a vulnerability, an open wound, through which the great enemy seeks to bleed our reality dry. Your power is not a sword for you to wield, but a cancer for us to control. You will learn that control through discipline. You will learn that discipline through pain. Forget your names. Forget your homes. You are nothing but potential instruments, and we shall see if you are worth tuning, or must simply be melted down for scrap." The lessons were brutal and systematic. The first was control, taught through agony. Each neophyte was strapped into a device called a toleratus, a throne of wires and psychoconductive metal that monitored their every thought. They were shown images, horrifying scenes of demonic incursion, blissful visions of paradise, anything to provoke an emotional response. The slightest flicker of uncontrolled psychic energy, the smallest mental ripple, would trigger the machine. A searing jolt of pain, calibrated to their own psychic potential, would lance through their nervous system. They learned to wall off their minds, to build mental fortresses, to sever the connection between emotion and power. They learned to exist in a state of perpetual rigid calm, because the alternative was a pain that felt like their soul was being set on fire. The second lesson was combat, and it was a lesson in culling the weak. The neophytes were pitted against each other in what the instructors called the Psyculus, a circular arena where they would duel with their minds. There were no rules, save one: do not lose control. They were forced to hurl bolts of telekinetic force, to weave illusions, to assault each other's consciousness directly. To lose was not merely to be defeated. A poorly shielded mind could be permanently shattered, reducing a student to a drooling imbecile. A telekinetic blast gone awry could rupture organs and snap bones. The most terrifying outcome was a loss of control in the heat of battle. The instructors and the ever-present Silent Sisters would watch for any sign of a Psyker's power surging beyond their command. If it did, the duel would end abruptly with a bolt from a commissar's pistol or the swing of a sister's executioner blade. The arena floor was stained with the psychic residue of countless failures. Survival was a constant grinding struggle. The instructors were merciless, the discipline absolute. Any sign of insubordination, any hint of instability, any failure to meet the impossibly high standards, was met with immediate and final punishment. Students would vanish in the night, taken for resanctioning, never to be seen again. Kaelin saw a girl who could hear the final thoughts of the dying, driven mad by the constant screams in her head. She was dragged away, weeping. He saw a boy with pyrokinetic abilities lose control for a fraction of a second during a meditation exercise, singeing an instructor's robe. A null maiden incapacitated him with a touch before a guard put a bolt through his skull. The attrition rate was staggering. For every 100 Psykers who entered the Scholastia, perhaps 5 would live to see the final trials. It was a factory of trauma designed to burn away everything that made them human, their love, their fear, their hope, and leave behind only a cold, obedient tool, sharpened by pain and tempered in fear. Kaelin learned to suppress his dreams, to bury his memories of home under layers of psychic shielding. He learned to see his fellow students not as friends but as competitors, as obstacles in his own desperate bid for survival. He was being reforged, and the process was indistinguishable from being destroyed. After years of relentless torment that felt like a lifetime, after surviving the culling, the duels, and the endless psychological torture of the Scholastia Psychana, Kaelin was deemed ready. Not worthy, not skilled, but merely stable enough to endure the final soul-altering ordeal. This was the true purpose of all the pain, the capstone of their horrific education, the rite of sanctioning. It was not a graduation ceremony. It was a ritual of spiritual bondage, a process that would forever shackle his soul to the will of the Emperor. It was the moment he would cease to be a potential threat and become a certified tool. Kaelin and the handful of other survivors from his intake were led from the familiar gray halls of the Scholastia into the sacred precincts of the Emperor's palace itself. They descended for miles into the Earth's crust, through adamantium blast doors that could withstand orbital bombardment, past legions of the Adeptus Custodes, who stood like golden, unmoving statues, their contempt for the Psykers a palpable force. Their destination was a chamber that felt ancient and holy, yet terrifyingly alive. It was a vast, circular vault, the walls covered in a lattice of whirring machinery, glowing cables, and sacred inscriptions. At its center stood the instrument of their transformation, the sanctioning altar. It was a complex and terrifying throne of brass and dark iron covered in arcane devices, psychic resonators, and thick coiled cables that snaked across the floor like metallic serpents. He was stripped of his neophyte uniform and forced onto the cold, unyielding metal of the altar. Attendant tech priests, their flesh fused with machine, moved with unnerving purpose, chanting binary prayers as they shackled his limbs. Needles and probes were inserted into his flesh, connecting him to the monstrous apparatus. A heavy spiked helmet was lowered onto his head, its interior lined with 1,000 psychoconductive filaments that dug into his scalp. He was being hardwired into the very soul of the Imperial Palace. The lead priest, a magos of the Divisio Telepathica, stood before him, his face a cold, metallic mask. "You have been deemed salvageable." The magos intoned his voice a synthesized rasp. "You will now be made pure. You will gaze upon the light of the Master of Mankind. It will burn away your weakness and forge you anew. Pray that your soul is strong enough to survive the process, for many are simply incinerated by his glory." Then the ritual began. A switch was thrown and a low hum escalated into a deafening roar. Power, both technological and psychic, surged through Kaelin's body. It felt like being struck by lightning and drowned at the same time. His mind, trained for years to maintain its walls, was violently torn open. The machine forcibly connected his consciousness, his very soul, to the most powerful psychic entity in the galaxy, the Emperor of Mankind enthroned upon the Golden Throne. What he experienced then was beyond any definition of pain. It was not a physical sensation, but an existential one. He felt the Emperor's consciousness not as a thought or a voice, but as a psychic sun. It was a consciousness so vast, so powerful, so ancient, that his own sense of self was utterly consumed, a single drop of water falling into a star. He felt the Emperor's unending agony, the 10,000 years of suffering while bound to the Golden Throne. He felt his unimaginable willpower holding back the demonic hordes of the warp from breaching the gates of Terra. He felt the weight of 1,000,000 worlds, the silent screams of 1,000,000,000,000 souls, the unending burden of a dying empire. It was a torrent of agony, duty, and sacrifice on a scale that shattered his sanity into 1,000,000 pieces. In that searing holy light, his soul was burned clean. The lingering whispers of the warp, the seductive promises of demons were turned to ash. His own fears, his memories, his very identity were scoured away, cauterized by the Emperor's divine fire. Then, just as his being was about to be completely annihilated, the process reversed. The machine pulled him back, and in the psychic void left behind, the Emperor's will imprinted itself upon his soul. It was a brand, a seal of ownership. It felt like a circuit of pure gold had been etched into the very fabric of his spirit, a permanent ward against the temptations of chaos. But also an unbreakable chain. He was released from the machine, his body convulsing. He collapsed onto the cold floor, gasping, weeping, his mind a fractured ruin. The experience had aged him, leaving streaks of gray in his young hair and a haunted, distant look in his eyes that would never leave. He was no longer Kalen, the boy from the hive. He was a weapon forged and stamped with the seal of the master of mankind. He was a sanctioned Psyker. He belonged body and soul to the Imperium. The aftermath of the sanctioning was not a period of recovery, but of assessment. Kalen and the other survivors, their souls branded and their minds forever scarred, were herded into a stark, white chamber. Here there was no pretense of education or betterment. This was a place of judgment, a sorting facility for human souls. At the head of the chamber, flanked by stoic Praetorian guards and emotionless tech priests, stood a Lord Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus. His face was a stern mask, one eye a cold blue orb of augmetic precision. He held a data slate, and his gaze swept over the assembled Psykers with the detached air of a factor inspecting machinery. This was the final crucible where their ultimate purpose within the vast grinding engine of the Imperium would be decided. The core of the assessment was the assignment, a cold numerical and alphabetical designation of a Psyker's raw power. It was here that Kalen truly understood the terrifying spectrum of his curse. The Inquisitor's aide, a scribe with a reedy, monotonous voice, began the process, calling each Psyker forward to be scanned by an array of arcane devices. The results were announced without ceremony, each letter a pronouncement of doom or a sentence to a specific kind of hell. This was the Olympian scale, the measure of a soul's resonance in the warp. The weakest were classified as Omicron or She level, their abilities so faint they could barely cause a candle flame to flicker. At the other extreme were the legends, the nightmares, the Alpha and Alpha Plus Psykers, beings of such catastrophic potential that a single uncontrolled thought could unravel a city whose screams could tear a hole in reality itself. Most, like Kalen, fell somewhere in the middle, their gamma delta or beta level power making them potent, but theoretically controllable. The pronouncement of his own rating, Gamma Plus, felt less like a grade and more like the classification of a bomb's explosive yield. Once the measurements were complete, the sorting began. The Lord Inquisitor would make a simple, almost casual gesture, and a Psyker's fate would be sealed. The weakest, those whose souls were too dim to be reliably weaponized, were the first to be separated. A significant portion of these were assigned to the Astra Militarum as Weirdvein Psykers. Kalen watched as a group of 12 terrified souls were chained together by psychic dampening collars and led away. He knew their fate. They would be formed into unstable choirs, their paltry individual talents pooled together in a desperate attempt to manifest a single useful psychic phenomenon on the battlefield. They were human ammunition, treated with contempt by the soldiers they served alongside and prone to catastrophic explosive overload under pressure. An even grimmer fate awaited those deemed too weak even for that. They were handed over to the Adeptus Mechanicus, their bodies and minds to be lobotomized and repurposed into living psychic relays, arcane servitors or components in the vast machinery of the Imperial Palace, their consciousness scrubbed to make way for a single, unending function. Next came the group the instructors would have cynically called the fortunate. These were the stable, the disciplined, the ones whose power to control ratio fell within acceptable parameters. Kalen found himself shoved into this line. Most of them were destined for the Ordo Psi of the Astra Militarum to become Primaris Psykers. They would be the advisors to generals and lord commanders, battlefield seers, and living weapons, capable of turning the tide of a battle by boiling the blood of their enemies or erecting shields of pure force. It was a position of immense power and absolute paranoia. They would be respected for their utility, but forever watched by their attendant commissar, whose finger would never be far from the trigger of his bolt pistol, ready to deliver the Emperor's peace at the first sign of weakness or corruption. From this pool of the successful, a select few with specific aptitudes would be chosen for further, even more specialized training. The telepaths among them might be conscripted by the Inquisition. Others might be inducted into the mysterious Scholastica Telepathica, destined for the soul-binding ritual that would turn them into the blind, void-faring astropaths, the very communicators of the Imperium. But there was one final group sorted in absolute silence. It was comprised of two distinct sets of Psykers. The first were the failures of the Scholastia, those who were too unstable or weak-willed to be sanctioned, yet whose psychic spark made them too dangerous to simply discard. The second and far more terrifying were the few who had been classified as alpha level or beyond. They were too powerful. Their potential was so great that no amount of training or sanctioning could ever be considered a guarantee against disaster. The risk of one of them losing control, or worse, turning to chaos, was a threat on a strategic system-ending scale. For both these groups, the too weak and the too strong, there was only one possible fate. They were not led to a transport or another training facility. They were marched in the opposite direction, deeper into the sanctified rock of the palace. Their destination was the Sanctum Imperialis, the chamber of the Golden Throne. They were the ultimate tithe. Their souls, one by one, would be fed into the arcane machinery of the Emperor's life support, their psychic energies siphoned away in a slow, agonizing process that could last for months. They would become the fuel that powered the Astronomicon, the great psychic beacon that allowed travel through the void. Thousands die this way every single day, their sacrifice anonymous, their agony unimaginable, their souls the cost of keeping the Imperium from collapsing into darkness. Kalen watched them go, a silent, doomed procession, and knew that he had not so much succeeded as merely been assigned to a slower, more public form of execution. Kalen was not destined for the battlefields of the Astra Militarum. His assessment had revealed a rare and specific talent, a high degree of telepathic acuity, and a strong resistance to the psychic pressures of the void. He was not to be a sword, but a voice. He was selected for the Scholastica Telepathica, the sister school to the one he had just survived, where he would be trained for one of the most vital and tragic roles in the Imperium, to become an astropath. The training was different, yet no less grueling. Instead of focusing on raw combat power, it was an exercise in extreme mental discipline. He spent years learning to compose his thoughts into coherent coded messages that could be projected across unimaginable distances. He studied the intricate symbolic language of the astropathic choirs, the subtle nuances of psychic projection, and the 1,000 different ways a message could be corrupted by the malign influence of the warp. He was taught to become a filter, a conduit to receive the screaming, chaotic thoughts of another astropath, half a galaxy away, and decipher the single vital kernel of information hidden within. All this was in preparation for the final ritual, a procedure that made even the sanctioning seem like a prelude, the soul binding. Like the sanctioning, it took place in a deep, sacred chamber. He was again strapped to a complex arcane device, but this one was designed for a more specific purpose. The goal was not just to brand his soul, but to tie it directly into the psychic choir of the Astronomicon, to attune his mind to the very wavelength of the Emperor's light. The process was an evolution of the agony he had already endured. His consciousness was once again drawn towards the psychic supernova of the Golden Throne. But this time, instead of being scoured, a part of the Emperor's power was channeled directly into him. It was a torrent of energy so immense, so overwhelmingly pure, that it overloaded his mortal senses completely. The first thing to go was his sight. The sheer intensity of the Emperor's psychic light burned out his optic nerves, plunging him into a world of immediate and permanent physical blindness. The pain was excruciating, a searing heat behind his eyes that left him screaming in his restraints. But as his physical vision died, a new, terrifying form of perception was born. He was no longer blind. He could see the warp. He could perceive the galaxy not as a collection of stars and planets, but as a swirling, tempestuous sea of emotion and energy. He could see the Astronomicon as it truly was, a colossal psychic lighthouse, a pillar of golden fire that cut through the darkness, providing the only stable point of reference in the entire galaxy. He could see the souls of living creatures as flickering flames, and he could see the things that swam in the darkness between them, the demonic predators, the formless horrors as hungry, grasping shadows. His eyes were ritually removed and replaced with cybernetic implants that were purely cosmetic. He was given the traditional robes of an astropath and a staff to guide his sightless steps. He was now a member of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, a living transmitter, his mind a node in the galaxy's only communications network. His life became a cycle of meditation and transmission. He would be part of a choir, dozens of astropaths, working in unison to send or receive a message. To send was to scream a thought into the hurricane of the warp, hoping it would be carried by the currents of the Astronomicon to its intended recipient. To receive was to listen to that hurricane, to sift through the endless chorus of demonic laughter, the psychic screams of dying worlds, and the tempting whispers of the ruinous powers, all to catch a single fleeting message from a distant colleague. The burden was immense. The mental strain was constant. Every moment of his waking life was spent on the precipice of madness, staring into the abyss of the Imperium. He saw visions that would shatter the minds of ordinary men. He heard promises of power, of sight, of an end to his suffering from entities that wished only to devour him. The pressure to maintain clarity was absolute. A single misinterpreted word, a symbol read incorrectly, could have catastrophic consequences. A warning of an orc Wa arriving a week late could mean the doom of an entire sector. A fleet's jump coordinates received with a single digit out of place could send 1,000 warships plunging directly into a star, or worse, into a becalmed region of the warp, where they would be lost forever. He was a vital cog in the machine of the Imperium, but he was isolated, blind, and haunted his only window to reality being the very source of all its horrors. For those like Kalen who were sorted into the ranks of the Astra Militarum, life became a different kind of hell. Here, the Psyker, now bearing the title of Primaris Psyker, was not a communicator or a seer hidden in a sanctum, but a front-line weapon as crude and terrifying as a basilisk cannon. He was assigned to Akkadian Shock Troop Regiment, a cog in the Great Green War Machine. But he was a cog that every other part of the machine feared would shatter at any moment and destroy them all. On the battlefield, surrounded by the mudblood and endless cacophony of war, he was utterly and completely alone. The soldiers of his own platoon kept a mandatory unspoken distance. In the cramped confines of a chimera transport or a muddy trench, there was always a clear bubble of space around him. They did not speak to him save for direct orders from their sergeant. They did not share rations with him. They did not meet his eyes. To them, he was not a comrade in arms. He was a freak, a tool, a necessary evil, whose very presence felt like a contamination of their faith in the God Emperor. They would unconsciously make the sign of the Aquila when he passed, or mutter prayers of protection under their breath. Their fear was a palpable thing, a constant oppressive weight on his soul. And always just a few paces away was his shadow, the Commissar. A grim, stone-faced man with a bolt pistol strapped to his hip, whose duty was not to inspire the Psyker, but to watch him. The Commissar's gaze was constant and unwavering, a silent promise of the Emperor's mercy, a summary execution the very second the Psyker showed any sign of faltering, any hint of demonic influence, any flicker of uncontrolled power. In the heat of battle, this isolation became a terrifying tightrope act. The Psyker was a force multiplier expected to turn the tide against impossible odds. When a wave of charging orcs threatened to overwhelm their position, all eyes turned to him. He had to reach into himself, open the floodgates to the warp just enough to unleash hell, but never so much that hell itself would pour through. It was an act of supreme mental balance. Drawing too little power would be useless, resulting in his and his platoon's deaths. Drawing too much was an infinitely worse fate. As he channeled the Imperium, he could feel the predators of the void circling his soul, drawn to the scent of power like sharks to blood. He could hear their whispers slithering through the cracks in his concentration, offering him more power, promising victory, in exchange for just a little more control. He had to erect psychic shields in his mind, while simultaneously shaping a lightning bolt in the material world, a feat of mental gymnastics performed while under heavy fire. One mistake, one moment of emotional weakness, a surge of fear or rage, and the delicate dam could burst, potentially opening a warp rift in the middle of their formation, an act that would doom them all. Even his death was a tactical liability. For a guardsman, death in service to the Emperor was a final, honorable release. For a Psyker, it was a final, terrible danger. Should he fall in battle, his soul, a blazing beacon of psychic energy, would be violently untethered from its mortal anchor. On a battlefield saturated with the raw emotions of slaughter and death, his departing spirit would act as a dinner bell for any lurking warp entity. A demon could seize his soul in that fleeting moment, possessing his corpse and twisting it into a horrific new form. His body could rise again, infused with unnatural power, its eyes burning with malevolent light, and turn on the very soldiers he had died trying to protect. His death would not be the removal of a chess piece from the board. It would be the sudden promotion of a pawn to a monstrous queen. This was the ultimate reason for the Commissar's vigil. If the Psyker was to die, it was imperative that his brain, the seat of his consciousness, was utterly destroyed by a bolt round, ensuring his soul was snuffed out before it could become a gateway to damnation. There is a fate that transcends the battlefield, a destiny considered so vital that it lies at the very heart of the Imperium's continued agonizing existence. It is the final destination for the Psykers deemed too weak to be useful or too powerful to be safe. It is a sacrifice of such magnitude that it eclipses any single act of battlefield heroism. It is the solemn, silent duty of feeding the Golden Throne. This is the fate Kalen witnessed being handed down in the sorting chambers, the final anonymous end for thousands upon thousands of his kind. The journey to this final end begins with a procession. A long, shuffling line of gray-clad Psykers, their minds already hollowed out by despair or powerful psychic suppressants. These are the rejects of the Scholastia Psychana, the unstable, the weak-willed, those whose souls were judged too flawed to be forged into reliable weapons. They are the psychic chaff, yet their dim souls still hold a spark of the Imperium, and that spark is a resource the Imperium cannot afford to waste. They are marched under heavy guard through the deepest, most sacred and secret passages of the Imperial Palace on Terra. They walk in a dreadful silence, a column of the damned, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They are the living dead souls already condemned, marching toward their own dissolution. Their destination is a vast, cavernous chamber known as the Sanctum Imperialis, a place of such technological and psychic complexity that it defies mortal understanding. At its heart lies the Golden Throne, the colossal arcane life support system that preserves the broken body of the Emperor of mankind. It is a machine of mythic proportions, a web of shimmering energy fields, humming conduits, and golden machinery that sprawls like the city of a dead god. It is here that the Emperor wages his eternal war, his psychic might, holding the forces of chaos at bay and projecting the light of the Astronomicon across the galaxy. But this divine machine requires fuel. It requires a constant, massive influx of psychic energy to sustain its function, and the souls of these Psykers are that fuel. One by one, they are led forward by silent tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They offer no resistance. They are strapped into alcoves that line the great chamber, their bodies connected by a mesh of thick cables and crystalline probes to the central apparatus of the throne. There is no ceremony, no final prayer. There is only the cold, brutal efficiency of a process that has been repeated daily for 10,000 years. When the connection is made, the great machine begins its work. It is not a quick or merciful process. It is a slow, methodical draining. The Psykers' life force, their memories, their emotions, their very soul stuff is siphoned out of them, drawn down the cables as raw psychic energy. They experience an agony beyond all comprehension, their consciousness dissolved molecule by molecule, their spirit unmade over the course of weeks or even months. They are consumed, their entire existence rendered down to a few precious watts of spiritual power to keep the great machine running. This is the silent, uncelebrated martyrdom at the heart of the Imperium. Every ship that navigates the warp does so by the light of a beacon, powered by the death screams of these forgotten souls. Every planet in the segmentum solar is shielded from the horrors of the warp by a barrier maintained by their agonizing sacrifice. 10,000 Psykers a day are fed to the throne, their names forgotten, their lives erased, their sacrifice known only to the cold logic of the Imperium's survival. They are not remembered as heroes. They are recorded as a consumed resource, a statistic in the grim arithmetic of a galaxy at war. Theirs is the ultimate testament to the Psyker's curse, to be born with a power that marks you for destruction, and to have your very soul become the final desperate offering to a silent, dying god. For a soul chained by the Imperium, subjected to a lifetime of pain, fear, and servitude. What is freedom? For a sanctioned Psyker, there is often only one path that feels like escape, but it is a path that leads to a deeper, more profound damnation. It is the path of the outcast, the renegade, the rogue Psyker. It is the final, desperate act of a mind that can no longer bear the weight of its chains. Imagine the Primaris Psyker Marius after years of endless war. He has survived countless battles, his mind a fortress of discipline. But every battle leaves another crack in his defenses. Every time he channels the warp, he feels the seduction of its power. Every night he dreams of the horrors he has witnessed and perpetrated. The fear and hatred from his comrades have eroded his spirit, and the cold, a watchful eye of the Commissar has become an unbearable pressure. One day, during a chaotic planetary evacuation amidst the confusion and fire, he makes a choice. In a moment where no one is watching, he slips away into the ruins of a shattered city. He runs, shedding his uniform, discarding his rank, and severing his ties to the Imperium. He is now a rogue Psyker, and he has just become the most wanted man on the planet. This is not the freedom he imagined. He is hunted. The Imperium that trained him now directs its merciless wrath upon him. The local authorities, the Astra Militarum, even the Inquisition itself, will be mobilized to find the asset that has gone rogue. He is a walking bomb, and they will kill him on sight. He is also hunted by others. The criminal underworld might see him as a prize to be captured and sold. Xenos races might see him as a curiosity or a weapon, And worst of all, the forces of the warp which he has been trained his entire life to fight, now see him as an unprotected, irresistible lure. Alone, terrified, and pushed to the brink of starvation and insanity, the whispers he has fought for so long begin to sound different. They no longer feel like a threat, but like a comfort in his profound isolation. They offer him solace. They tell him he was right to flee. They praise his strength. They speak of a galaxy where his powers would not be a curse to be shackled, but a gift to be celebrated. The Chaos Gods, the great predators of the warp, extend their promises. Khorne offers him strength to crush his pursuers. Tzeentch offers him forbidden knowledge and mastery over his powers. Nurgle offers him an end to his pain, and a place where he will always belong. Slaanesh offers him the exquisite ecstasies he has been forced to deny himself his entire life. In a moment of ultimate despair, cornered in a ruined sanctuary by a squad of Imperial enforcers, he finally breaks. He can't fight them in his own burgeoning power. He opens his mind not to the cold, rigid control of his training, but to the warm, welcoming embrace of the voices. He accepts. The power that floods into him is intoxicating, exhilarating. It is 1,000 times greater than anything the Scholastia Psychana ever allowed him to touch. The transformation is instantaneous and horrific. His flesh contorts and reshapes itself, blessed with the unholy mutations of his chosen patron. His eyes burn with raw warp light. The psychic energy he unleashes is no longer a controlled lightning bolt, but a tidal wave of pure chaos that melts his pursuers into screaming puddles of flesh. He is free. He is no longer a slave to the Imperium. But as he stands there laughing in his monstrous new form, he is blind to the new chains that have wrapped themselves around his soul. He has traded a visible cage for an invisible one, becoming a willing pawn for powers infinitely more cruel and capricious than the Imperium of man. This is the ultimate tragedy of the Psyker. The only path to freedom is through a deeper, more absolute form of slavery. It is the most bitter and Pyrrhic victory imaginable, and so the story ends where it began, in darkness. We have followed the path of the afflicted, the journey of the soul, cursed with the ability to see the truth of the universe, a truth of screaming, ravenous insanity. We have traced this life from its first terrified inception to its final inevitable dissolution. It is a journey that begins with a child's nightmare and ends in a galaxy's unending scream. Whether they walk the path of loyalty or the path of rebellion, the destination remains unchanged. There is no escape, there is no victory, there is only the curse and the varying flavors of damnation it offers. Consider the arc, the grim and tragic trajectory of this existence. It begins with the whispers, a terrifying intrusion into the innocence of youth. A power born not of will but of happenstance turns a child into a monster in the eyes of their own family, their own community. The world shrinks, a cage of fear and superstition built around them long before the Imperium's physical shackles arrive. The harvest by the black ships is not a rescue from this persecution, but its ultimate bureaucratic expression. The child is no longer a person, but a resource, a tithe of flesh and soul, to be rendered down for the Imperium's use. They are given a number and stripped of a name, the first of many deaths they will endure. Then comes the crucible of Terra, the so-called education, that is nothing less than the systematic demolition and reconstruction of a soul. The Scholastia Psychana does not nurture. It breaks. It uses pain as a chisel to chip away at all that is human empathy, hope, love, leaving behind only the cold, hard stone of discipline and fear. The rite of sanctioning. The supposed graduation is the final brand of ownership, the searing of the Emperor's mark onto a soul that is no longer its own. They emerge not as masters of their power, but as slaves to it, forever chained to the will of a distant, dying master, and haunted by the agonizing glory of his gaze. From there, the paths diverge, yet they all lead to the same precipice. The lucky ones are forged into weapons. They become the Primaris Psyker, standing on the battlefield as a living god, yet viewed with hatred and terror by the very men they protect, forever shadowed by the Commissar's promise of a quick and brutal end. Or they become the Astropath, their eyes burned out, to better see the madness of the void, spending their lives as a lonely blind ship in a sea of cosmic horrors, forever straining to hear a single sane voice amidst a choir of demonic temptations. And what of the others? The silent marching columns of the weak and the unstable, whose final purpose is to become screaming fuel for the Golden Throne. Theirs is not a life, but a slow, agonizing consumption, their entire existence reduced to a flicker of energy that holds the darkness at bay for one more second. Is this service? Or is it merely a prolonged and torturous execution? And what of the one who chooses freedom? The one who breaks his chains, who flees the oppression of the Imperium in a desperate bid for self-determination? He finds only a more insidious form of slavery waiting in the shadows. The promises of chaos are a sweet poison to a soul that has known only bitterness. In exchange for an illusion of power and revenge, he trades his humanity, his sanity, his very being. He becomes a puppet of the dark gods, a monster far more terrible than the one his persecutors imagined his freedom, a shackle that binds him to an eternity of damnation. In the grim darkness of the far future, psychic power is not a gift. It is a verdict, handed down at birth. It is an incurable disease of the soul. Every path, that of the loyal servant, the dutiful sacrifice, or the damned rebel, concludes in agony, in madness, in an oblivion where a soul is either devoured by the machine it serves or the monsters it embraces. The life of a Psyker is the ultimate testament to the horrifying truth of this galaxy, that even the most powerful individuals, beings who can bend reality to their will, are nothing more than pawns on a cosmic chessboard. They are ephemeral, tragic figures born into a war they did not choose, blessed with a power that ensures their destruction. Their struggles, their triumphs, and their screams are but a momentary, insignificant echo in the vast, cold, and uncaring cacophony of the warp.